Hi, everyone. Tonight's story starts with a simple experiment that leads to a question about the world most people would never think to ask. So get comfortable and keep your eyes on the screen. Dylan Whitaker lived in Denver, worked as a systems analyst at a bank, and spent his evenings on the roof of a 9-story apartment building watching the sky. He ran a small blog for amateur astronomy, where he showed simple experiments: how to estimate the distance to the moon using shadows, how to guess the time from the sun without a clock. In the spring of 2023, he came up with a new crowd project. He asked followers in different countries to place identical sticks at noon and measure the length of the shadow, then send him the results with coordinates. At first, everything went as expected. The tables fit neatly into the familiar school model: sphere, sun, angles, roughly the same numbers as the textbooks. Dylan made a video, explained the geometry, and was already planning to wrap up the experiment as a successful piece of public science. Then he got bored and decided to make it harder. He asked the same participants to measure shadows not only at noon, but also in the morning and closer to sunset. And he found volunteers in the United States, Chile, Japan, and on Pacific Islands. He set aside a separate line for remote prairie towns in western Kansas, where the horizon was barely blocked by hills or tall buildings. At night, he sat with his laptop, combining the data and marking unusual points in red, places where the result clearly fell outside the calculations, even after accounting for error. After a couple of weeks, the map was covered in blotches, and in some of them, the angles of light looked as if the horizon line made a sudden bend. Dylan spent a long time looking for an ordinary mistake: a time zone problem, bad coordinates, the wrong stick height. He rechecked emails, messaged participants again, and asked them to repeat the measurements at the same hours. Some people really had confused the time, but even after corrections, several stubborn areas remained on the map where the shadows behaved too strangely. In a private report to himself, he wrote only one sentence: "If you treat Earth as a normal sphere, the numbers do not work." On one international astronomy forum under his post, some user jokingly suggested, "Try a cube. Maybe the world isn't a sphere at all, just a very neat box." Dylan smirked, but with nothing better to do, he entered a cube model into the program. He imagined people living on one flat face of a giant solid, with sunlight striking it at different angles. He entered the same coordinates and calculated how shadows should behave in such a world. To his surprise, the cubic model matched part of the strange points almost perfectly, especially in a band running from West Texas out into the Gulf of Mexico. He spent several more nights at the screen, adjusting the parameters step by step, adding terrain, atmosphere, elevation. Each time, the cube explained the data more stubbornly than the familiar sphere. In the margin of his notebook, Dylan carefully drew a circle and a square beside it and wrote, "If no one had ever told me what shape Earth was, I'd pick this." At first, he decided the whole thing was simply a good opportunity to show a broad audience how much the shape of a planet affects the simplest observations. Dylan wrote a draft article for a popular science magazine. He stated honestly that he had no doubt Earth was spherical, but a series of amateur measurements had unexpectedly lined up with a cube model. He described the method in detail, included tables, and asked the editors to look over the calculations and point out his mistake. The reply came a couple of weeks later and was surprisingly short. The editors thanked him for his interest in science, but said the piece did not fit the publication and might trigger unnecessary debate. Not a word about the formulas themselves, not one comment on the math. Dylan sent a revised version to another English-language outlet and one online journal. The replies were just as polite and evasive: controversial topic, risk of misinterpretation. What bothered him most was an anonymous review passed along by a professor he knew who had taken part in the evaluation. It said that similar models had been considered in closed research programs back in the 1970s, and strongly advised the author not to discuss such topics in public. It did not sound like ordinary criticism. It sounded more like a careful warning. After that, Dylan decided to see whether there were any irregularities in real navigation data over the same regions where his shadows seemed to break. From public sources, he gathered information on flight paths, satellite orbits, and zones of unstable navigation signal. In pilot materials, he found notes about sections over the ocean and deep inland where navigation instruments sometimes behaved unpredictably, and crews were advised to confirm the route visually. One section especially caught his attention, over the Gulf and inland across West Texas. On route maps, it appeared as a straight line, but pilot reports mentioned brief jolts in altitude and strange coordinate jumps. Dylan laid that zone over his shadow map and saw an almost perfect match. It seemed to him that this was where the hidden geometry of the world creaked, and the equipment smoothed it over for ordinary users. He tried requesting more detailed data on the operation of certain satellites through an acquaintance at a research institute. A few days later, the man replied that the files technically existed, but access to them was restricted for internal reasons, even though that kind of information was usually open. In a phone call, the acquaintance lowered his voice and said that people at the top had known about difficult zones for a long time and simply preferred that no one dig too deeply into them. When Dylan tried discussing his conclusions in a large American science community online, his post first picked up dozens of comments and then suddenly disappeared. In a private message, an administrator apologized and explained that he had received a recommendation not to give space to conspiratorial topics about the structure of Earth. He suggested Dylan make a series about ordinary planets and stars instead. A few days later, the blogger was invited in for a conversation at a local office, officially to clarify where he was getting navigation data and whether he had violated any rules connected to mapping materials. Two men in plain clothes politely asked what programs he had used and who he had sent the documents to. There were no direct threats, but at the end, one of them said, almost like friendly advice, "Better stick to the kind of work that helps people look at the sky, not hunt for cracks in what we're all standing on." Soon after that, his shadow experiment videos were labeled questionable information, monetization was disabled, and new uploads became harder to find in search. Subscribers wrote that they were no longer seeing his updates in their feeds, even with notifications turned on. Late that night, Dylan wrote in his journal, "I only asked why the shadows behave strangely. I never got an answer. I got silence instead, and it felt like a wall." In the fall, he decided that if people were already accusing him of playing games with maps, he should at least test his calculations once in the real world. Dylan chose a stretch of Gulf Coast, where, according to his data, the discrepancies were strongest. He drove there in an old SUV and rented a small motorboat from a local fisherman. On the deck, he mounted a long metal pipe so he could watch the shadow directly over the water, and he installed simple sensors to track the angle of sunlight. At noon on a clear day, with the water calm, he took the boat along the calculated path. For about 2 hours, everything looked normal. The shadow changed length smoothly, and the instruments showed familiar numbers. Then, over a perfectly even stretch, the sensor needle jerked. The angle jumped suddenly, as if the sun had hopped for a second. The shadow of the pipe fell somewhere it should not have if any normal spherical model were right. Dylan repeated the measurement several times, moving slowly back and forth along the same line. Every time at the same spot, the angle broke, as if the boat were crossing an invisible boundary. If he plugged those numbers into his cube model, it suggested that the surface of the world tilted there slightly, like the face of a giant body. Sitting on the boat, he was caught by a strange feeling, as if he were gliding along the edge of some unknown figure, and the familiar map of the world was only a neat covering stretched over something far more angular underneath. When he returned to Denver, Dylan tried sending the results quickly to several people he trusted, and once again ran into an invisible barrier. The report files either failed to upload or came back marked as violations of security policy, and one service simply blocked his account without explanation. A day later, he received a short email from a one-use address with no signature. Your calculations are close to reality. Just accept this. Humanity lives on one side. That is enough. No reply he sent to that message was ever delivered. The mailbox vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Dylan sat for a long time in front of the screen, rereading the sentence and not daring to show it to anyone else. That evening, he stepped onto the balcony, looked at the sunset over the city, and suddenly caught himself on a disturbing thought. If people really did live on only one face of something much larger, then somewhere there must be other sides, with their own seas, mountains, and people who knew nothing about him, just as he had known nothing about them. And maybe those who had once shut down the research into strange shadows and corrected routes had already decided that people on this side were better off never learning what kind of thing their home actually stood on. When he went back inside, Dylan took the round globe from the shelf where it had sat since his school years and hid it in the closet. On the desk, he left only a sheet of paper with a square drawn on it, divided by lines of latitude and longitude. Beneath it, he wrote just two words: Our side.